Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the first chapter of the book of Joshua. Now, the book of Joshua represents a historical continuum from its predecessor, the book of Deuteronomy, but also a narrative or genre transition, whereas its 5 predecessor books are classified by the Pentateuch, from the Greek word 5. Or Torah, which in Hebrew translates as the law. This is classified generally according to what is known as the writings. There are 3 major divisions according to which the ancient Hebrews classified the Old Testament writings, those being the law, the writings, and the prophets. And Christians are generally inclined to classify them according to 4 criteria, those being the law, history, wisdom, literature, and prophecy. Now, that is not to say that all of these respective genres are completely devoid of the qualities of any others. There is, for example, very much the law is of central significance in all of the genres. All of the genres contain nuggets of wisdom, and all of them are in at least some sense historical. But I think that the primary, they're classified as such because their primary emphasis is according to that. And as we read in Joshua, the law is still of paramount significance. It is the distinguishing mark of the Hebrew people. So without further ado, we're going to jump into the text itself. And the first verse reads, "And it came to be, after the death of Moses, the servant of Yahweh, that Yahweh spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, the assistant of Moses, saying," Now, Joshua was the designated successor of Moses, who remained the standard Hebrew leader. For example, in Deuteronomy 34:9, we read, "And Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses has laid his hand on him." That was the general action through which the ordinance of leadership was transmitted. "And the children of Israel listened to him and did as Yahweh had commanded Moses. And since then no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face." That's verse 10. That's somewhat besides the point, but it suffices to say that Joshua was his successor, but he was ultimately a man that no one could ultimately replace. Verse 2 reads, "Moses, my servant, is dead. So now arise, pass over this garden, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, to the children of Israel." Now, the land he's referring to is the chosen land, which would come to be known as Israel, but was the indigenous inhabitants were, there were 7 nations they replaced, the primary ones of which were Canaanites, so it was priorly known as Canaan, and one of the inhabitants were the Philistines, who were of Aegean pirate origin, and today it's known as Palestine, as a direct insult almost to non-authorized intrusive invader. "And every place on which the sole of your foot treads I have given you, as I spoke to Moses." So it was called the Promised Land because it was so promised to them. And the promise is continued, that wherever they lay their foot is going to be essentially theirs. "From the wilderness and this Lebanon, even as far as the great river, the river Pereth, all the land of the Hittites, and to the great sea towards the going down of the sun is your border." The great sea we understand to be the Mediterranean, which was the eastern border of Israel, and the great river was the Euphrates, which was to be the western border. Now, Israel to this date has yet to lay at least the fullness of what has been their promised land. But to various extents, they have held extensive territories. The details of the geopolitical dimensions are the intricacies of which lay beyond the range of this present discourse. No man is going to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so am I with you. I do not fail you nor forsake you. Now, this is a conditional promise, implicitly contingent upon the fact that Joshua, who there is no evidence of him being faithless, was faithful and inspired his people to be to have the same quality. Be strong and courageous, for you are to let this people inherit the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Now, courage was one of the distinguishing marks of Joshua, who alone he was one of two spies. The other's name was Caleb, whose nephew, I believe, Othniel, was Hebrew's original judge, which was the form of government that Israel adopted after Joshua established the land as their own. Judge was not so much a judicial term as a military leader term, but they were distinct from the majority of the spies who were sent out at the behest of Moses to spy or investigate the what was to be the promised land, and they alone had an optimistic outcome for their chances of taking. The other leaders were stricken with fear because the land was inhabited by giants. And we read as early as Genesis 6:4 that the existence of what might be called giants roamed the earth. In Deuteronomy, we read one King Og was 13 feet in length, and even in the proto-monarchical period, one by the name of Goliath was 9 foot 4 inches. So this is intimidating to those who walk by sight and not by faith. But Joshua and Caleb were distinct from the other spies in that they walked with faith. They knew they had the almighty maker of heaven and earth on their side, that no giant, no matter how physically imposing, could propose an obstacle to their promised conquest, which he promised them. But because they were in the minority, the majority, their mission lasted 38 days, and this was after they had been 2 years escaped from Israel, from Egypt. So as punishment, Yahweh made them wander from Egypt to the Promised Land, which is the equivalent distance of the state of New Jersey, for as many years as the mission was days. So they spent 40 days wandering essentially in a circle of which should have taken much longer. Now, my standard for interpretation of Bible is that if the literal sense makes common sense, seek no other sense. So I'm inclined to believe that it literally was a 40 years. Many Hebrew scholars interpret the term 40 years as meaning just a very long time, and they have the right to believe what they believe. But my belief, I state right now, stands with the literal interpretation of the 40-year mark. Only be strong and very courageous to do according to all the Torah which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it left or right, so that you act wisely wherever you do. Now, as I mentioned before, the genres of wisdom literature and law are interchangeable. The law is very much a species of wisdom, and the prophets, their dictates and messages were entirely within the parameters of the covenant. They repeatedly admonished the rulers to obey the covenants or be subjected to the warnings contained therein. But more to the point, do not turn from it left or right. That means do not deviate from it. They're directly outlined. Do not add to it. Do not take away from it. We read in Deuteronomy 4:12 and 12:32 and Proverbs 35 through 6. And Revelation 22:18 through 19, that there are in fact consequences for adding or taking away from the law. So the outlines are pretty clear, and they're to be followed directly and without argument and without elaboration. And There's really no room for creation for it. There is a word for that, and it's heretic, ultimately. Those who manufacture their own interpretations above the revealed laws are essentially heretics, for no better word. Do not let this book of the Torah depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you keep to do according to all that is written in it. For then you shall make your ways prosperous and act wisely. Now, the Sabbath is a specific day designated for which we are to worship Yahweh in fellowship with the community of believers, but discipleship is ultimately a daily endeavor. Matthew 6:10, we're commanded to pray for our daily bread. Luke 9:23, we're commanded to take up our cross daily. So there is Sunday saint is no substitute for the authentic disciple. And the word meditate in Hebrew means to mutter. And the Hebrew practice, you may notice Jews, they frequently bow their head and recite the words, contemplating their meaning. Each religion has their variety of worship. Christians get on their knees and pray. Muslims lay face down in abject surrender. Buddhists and Hindus strike a meditative pose. And there is a misnomer that meditation is an exclusively Eastern religion-oriented practice. But the Bible, in many places, says that it is, in fact, a scriptural practice. Psalm 19:14 immediately comes to mind. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be worthy and acceptable in your sight. That's a paraphrase, but it also reiterates the connection of saying and thinking, through which the Hebrew word mutter is rooted, which translates as meditate, really falls into mutter. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, nor be discouraged, for Yahweh your Elohim is with you wherever you go. Now, there is no place for a cowardly Christian. It is a sin that God hates, and it is not without reason that cowards are listed at the very top of the list for those destined for the lake of fire. In Revelation 21:8, the Christian life is not for cowards, and sometimes we're commanded to fight, sometimes it takes courage not to fight. The Savior could have easily summoned 10,000 angels to his defense to prevent his crucifixion, but it was ultimately in the will of the Father to endure the crucifixion for our behalf so that we might be saved. But the Israelites were in fact commanded to fight for the land. It was not to be given to them automatically. They had to do their part in fighting for it. And Yahweh your Elohim is with you wherever you go. Now that is inasmuch as you remain faithful in obedience. This is not an automatic promise. There are conditions to the promise. It's presumptuous to assume that he's with us just simply because we deserve him, because we call ourselves Christians without following his dictates and precepts. And Yahshua commanded the officers of the people, saying, Pass through the midst of the camp and command the people, saying, Prepare food for yourselves, for within 3 days you are passing over this garden, to go into possession of the land which Yahweh your Elohim is giving you to possess. And Yahshua spoke to the Reubenites and the Gadites and to half the tribes of Manasseh, saying, these were all respective tribes of Israel, remember the words which Moses, servant of Yahweh, commanded you, saying, Yahweh your Elohim is giving you rest, and he shall give you this land. And rest is an intrinsic element of the Sabbath, but the rest had to come ultimately after a struggle for warfare. The indigenous inhabitants weren't going to willfully surrender them, but once after they obeyed the command to fight, they were promised rest. Let your wives, your little ones, and your livestock stay in the land which Moses gave to you beyond the garden. But you shall pass before your brothers armed, and your brave fighters, and shall help them. Until Yahweh has given your brothers rest, as unto you, so shall they also take possession of the land which Yahweh your Elohim is giving them. Then you shall return to the land of your possession, and shall possess that which Moses, the servant of Yahweh, gave you beyond the garden towards the rising of the sun. And they answered Joshua, saying, All that you have commanded us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. According to all that we obeyed Moses, so we obey you. Only let Yahweh your Elohim be with you, as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your commands and does not obey your words, and all that you command him, is put to death. Only be strong and courageous. So we read there were quite clearly consequences for disobedience, and ultimately I'm deprived of time of elaborating or interpreting on some of the passages I just mentioned as much as I would like, but I do remain at the mercy of technology. And I do look forward to continuing this topic, so stay tuned till next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.